Hi, everyone. We're so pleased to be back with you today. My name is Dr. Betsy Crouch. I'm a neonatologist at UCSF and an assistant professor. And this is the At the Bench segment of the Incubator podcast. I'm here joined with two of my dear friends and colleagues. Dr. Misty Good, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Misty Good, and I'm a neonatologist scientist and division chief of neonatology at UNC Chapel Hill. And I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our guest today, Dr. Amélie
Woo-hoo.
Collins, is a R1 funded neonatologist and associate professor at Cincinnati Children's, who recently moved within the last year. So she's going to talk about her journey there. But she studies fetal myelopoiesis in the setting of maternal infection to improve neonatal outcomes. Amelie, would you like to introduce yourself and briefly explain your research focus?
Sure. So first off, thanks so much for having me. This is an honor, to be honest, and I'm really excited to be here. So as you said, so my name is Amelie Collins, and I am also a neonatal physician scientist. I recently moved to Cincinnati Children's to start up my own independent laboratory. My background is as an immunologist, and I'm still an immunologist, but I shifted focus when did my postdoctoral work to really focus on hematopoietic stem cells, which I like to remind everyone they are actually the stem cell of the immune system, and so that's why I haven't stopped being an immunologist. But I study hematopoietic stem cells, specifically in the fetus and neonate, sort of trying to understand how the unique biology of those cells in that developmental window contributes to the really unique hematopoietic landscape and immune landscape that babies have, and in turn, why that sets them up for being more susceptible to infection. Um, and yeah, that's what I focus on.
I'm so excited to talk about all of this today. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to hear you answer the mystery of why our babies are uniquely susceptible to infection.
Yes.
Spoiler
Oh,
alert, I don't know, but it's why I have a job to try and help figure that out. So
yeah, I'll bet you have some unique insights that our listeners will really appreciate. So why don't we could just get started, digging into that topic. We'd love to hear more about, your career as a physician scientist, maybe your early days in a lab, what inspired you, to become the scientist that you are currently, and if there were any clinical observations also that drove you on that path.
sure, I think I did not grow up knowing I wanted to be either a physician or a scientist. Actually, I was a philosophy major in college. But I went to the University of Chicago, and there was a core curriculum there, which was quite robust. And so everyone had to take a bit of everything. And I had to take a biology class as a freshman. And so I took, the equivalent of rocks for jocks or whatever, that was basically like immunology for like philosophers. That's not what the course was called, but the equivalent. Um, it was taught by a pediatric oncologist who taught immunology through the lens of pediatric leukemias and how discoveries and research in immunology helped us learn about childhood cancer, how childhood cancer had, there were questions about it that then went back to the bench kind of thing. And it was that just like that was it. I was captivated, right? And
It was that at that during undergrad?
yeah, it was my
Wow.
freshman year of undergrad that
That's
I
amazing.
realized it was my favorite class. I loved it. And this idea that, I mean, maybe because it was so human, right? It wasn't a quote, dry nuts and bolts science class. It was really, like, why do we do science in the first place? It's to answer questions and to answer questions to help make people feel better, right? And so that first introduction is why I do this, right? Is because it's so much fun and was really the the introduction to sort of that duality of basic research and clinical medicine and how the 2 can interplay. Um, and so I was like, "Oh my god, well, so this is it. So I wanna, study science now." And, at the time, I was kind of young and naive, and I was like, well, if I am interested in biology, then obviously that means I'm pre-med because everyone around me that was taking biology classes was pre-med. But I also wanted to join an immunology lab because that was the class that had really piqued my interest. And so I ended up emailing this woman named Anne Sperling, who was is an immunologist, was at the time at the University of Chicago, and saying, I love immunology. Who knew? And can I volunteer in your lab? Like, I don't want to get paid. I just want to I'll whatever. And so she ended up taking me on. I was in her lab for 3 years as an undergrad and then stayed on for a full year after graduation as a technician. Um, and, but also was like moving forward with pre-med classes because again, I thought that's just what everyone did around me. And at one point she was like, there are some people who do both. And I was like, what are you talking about? So I was introduced to this concept of going and getting an MD, PhD and being a physician scientist. And so from the outset, for me, it was always the science that pushed me to do that. And always sort of like the research and how do we understand disease? How do we investigate it when we don't understand it? Sort of what is the mechanism? What's the why? That was always what interested me. And I was really interested in immunology, and like the beauty and sometimes curse when you're trying to make career choices of immunology is that it exists everywhere. There's no system or disease or anything that cannot have an immune cell component to it. And so that kind of meant that it wasn't always obvious what I was going to do. Um, so then I was lucky enough to go to NYU for my MD PhD, ended up doing my PhD with Dan Littman. That was a really great experience. It was a huge lab full of postdocs. And for most of the time, I was the only grad student there. But it was a great place to learn to do A, rigorous science, and B, very aspirational science. There wasn't a limit to the kinds of questions that could be asked and answered in Dan's
That's
lab.
that's nice, and
It
for training,
Yeah, and as a trainee, so it kind of spoils me to just, I'm not interested in what, you know, can be done. I'm interested in what I wanna do, and then you figure out the can piece of it afterwards. So that was a I don't know that I would have described it as fun the entire time I was there, but it was fun. I had a great experience, doing my PhD there, and then, to the
We're
point.
interested in, sorry, Emily, we're
Yep.
interested in mentoring also as a part of
Yeah.
this. So I'm curious, it sounds like you did have a really productive, and supported time there. But, what did that look like on a day-to-day basis?
It's funny, I think, I had a very good mentorship experience, and I loved doing my thesis with Dan. He's wonderful. He gave all of his people a lot of autonomy, and especially as a little old grad student in a sea of postdocs, at the time, there were definitely moments where I felt as though a little bit less autonomy would have been good for me, but then I also wouldn't have had the training experience that I did. So I wouldn't trade that for anything. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna say that's probably what, like, pushed you and drove you to, like, all your discoveries. I I tend to give a lot of autonomy and I tell people, though, upfront that I do this, but I will rescue them. Like, if they're
right.
going down a rabbit hole and I
Yeah.
see them, I'll try to pull them out, before they're deep in there, but
Well, it's funny because I knew this about, sort of having had all of this autonomy. And so, skipping forward a few stages, I ended up doing what I consider to be sort of my second sort of postdoctoral fellowship with Emmanuelle Passegué at Columbia. And she's the person that I went to when I decided I wanted to be a hematopoietic stem cell biologist. And part of why I went to her, amongst many other reasons, is that I really wanted someone to be more hands-on with me because I had not experienced that. So sort of at the end of my training career, like I went back to what, maybe some people start with and then feel like they should graduate to more autonomy. Um, but it worked at the time. And it's interesting to hear you say that, Misty, because now that I'm starting my own lab, I'm very sort of self-conscious about sort of developing my mentorship style and vacillating between, well, I have to be very intentional about it and spell everything out and have a philosophy for all things. And also being like, I cannot be rigid about this. It has to be organic. Like the mentorship has to fit each individual person, and I'm not going to know what they're like as people until I meet them. And so, yeah, mentorship for everybody. I'm sure everyone says this, and it's true. It's so important. That really shapes your perspective on what is doable, how to do it, um, sort of how to conduct yourself as a researcher. And I've been fortunate to have lots of really good mentors, each of whom has been so different from the other. And that's great because then you get to see, well, what of those approaches fits my personality? What doesn't? Um,
Oh, it's true. I mean, when I was a trainee in the lab, I was like, "Just tell me what to do. Give me a protocol and I'll do it." Like, I don't wanna have to, like, reinvent the wheel, and, as I'm an MD only, right? And so, I didn't have the whole PhD experience, so I was like, "Just give me the protocol, and we'll get it done." But, so I found a lot of, I don't know, distress when there wasn't a protocol or I had to, do something, like, create something myself. But then that's what makes science really fun is, like, tweaking the protocol or improving the protocol, right? So
yeah. Well, this is what I think is such a fundamental, I don't know, paradox about at least physician scientist training and maybe physician training is that I think a fundamental piece of learning to be a scientist is failing, heavy air quotes, learning how to when there isn't a protocol or when the protocol doesn't work or, how to troubleshoot or how to even know, what question you're trying to ask in the first place, right? And it is by definition impossible to protocolize that kind of training experience and doesn't necessarily align with the rigidity of clinical training, at least. Um, so I think, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about the duality of being a physician and a scientist and how they're similar and how they're different. Um, but yeah, that's one of the things I think through all of my training experiences, um, there was a lot of autonomy and not an enormous amount of protocolization. And I really like that and value that, and I think that it's so important for people to figure out their own path, right? Their own question, how they like to answer that question, how they like to interpret what comes from that question. Um, and, I've been fortunate to also have been given time as a trainee, so my training experiences have been fairly long. Um, as in Emmanuelle's lab, I was there for 7 years as an assistant professor in title the whole time, but I had, for a variety of reasons, the luxury of having that amount of time to make my mistakes and to figure out what my question was and to figure out so sort of to like take the time to not get it right away, and I'm again in the moment there were definitely times where I was frustrated by how long things were taking, but now that it's done, I wouldn't trade that experience for anything because, now what I know, I know. There's that sense of certainty about like, oh well, I know all of the ways to mess it up because I've done them. Um,
that's
and,
true.
and so but now as a mentor, how do you allow people? I love what you said. Like, yes, how do you allow people to sort of flail around, tread water a little bit on their own, but not let them drown? And when do you know when is that point at which to step in and say, let me give you some direction here, because you're not supposed to be a fully fledged thinker right away. That's the whole point, is that you're training to do that. And so that kind of plus or minus it's tricky.
It's tricky. It's a balance, right? You have to figure out you don't want them to struggle, but there is
Yeah.
some growth in the struggle.
Yes.
But you wanna make sure they don't lose hope and, they're building resilience in the process. But, speaking of resilience, so you mentioned 7 years, right?
Mhm.
Um, as an assistant professor. Can you talk a bit about your funding journey, like, over that time? Just
Yeah.
early career folks who are listening.
Sure.
Can we go
Absolutely.
back?
So,
Can we finish, Amelie? So,
yeah.
we were at your grad school time in
Oh yeah.
NYU, and
Yes.
then there was another postdoc, and then there was your time in Emmanuelle.
Yeah.
and
Sure.
just a little bit more of the chronology, and then I'd love also to hear about your funding.
So when I was finishing up my PhD, I wasn't actually even sure that I wanted to do residency. I loved the bench science so much. And again, the luxury of having a very extended training timeline is that I had to go back to the clinical rotations of medical school and, sit on that decision for a while. And I went back and I loved it, right? I went back and I loved it. And I was like, no, I want to be a physician too. I'm gonna do residency but still always knowing that I was gonna end up back in a lab somehow. Um, and I fell in love with pediatrics, for several reasons. One, it's just fascinating biology, right? If you're interested in development, which I am, then pediatrics is just that's development in action. Um, I liked the relative lack of hierarchy that exists in pediatrics relative to some other subspecialties. That suits my personality well. Um, and yeah, so that was a pretty straightforward decision to make. There were I loved everything about med school. My other two favorite rotations were psychiatry and surgery, which doesn't make any sense, but I loved both of those things. So I ended up matching at Columbia for peds residency. I did not think I was going to fast track, but I ended up doing that, which is this approved pathway whereby you can sort of reduce the amount of pediatric residency training time that you do from 3 years to 2 years, just fulfilling the core requirements, and then move into fellowship, subspecialty fellowship training. And so for me, I was lucky in that I was in the NICU September of my intern year. So not July. So I wasn't terrified about everything, but early enough that I could still make this decision. And I just remember like being in the NICU that first week and just having this sense of like, oh my God, I belong here. Like I loved the acuity. I loved the physiology. I loved the pathophysiology. I loved the people that I worked with, I just loved the acuity. I loved everything about it. And I was like, "It's the best, it's the best." It was just so obvious. It's so funny when I interview as an aside, when I interview, folks now for NICU fellowship and some of them and I asked them this question, "Why neonatology?" And they're like, "'Cause when I walked into the unit, I felt like I was at home." And I'm like, "Say no more. I get it. I totally get that." So I loved neonatology, and I remember speaking to my residency program director at the time and telling her, "My favorite thing about residency is research grand rounds." And she was like, "We need to get you back to a lab, pronto." So that's when I learned about this option of fast tracking, and it ended up making sense for me because I really knew I wanted as much research time as I could get. I had already started um, a research project. So my first postdoc, or sort of that in between, Betsy, that you asked about, I worked with Steve Reiner at Columbia while I was a resident, and for most of my fellowship, sort of focusing on early life natural killer cell development in humans. Um, and that's really when I was sort of figuring out scientifically what I wanted to do. Um, I think, again, the beauty of being forced to take as much time as we do in training is that I really had the time to think about what questions do I want to ask and answer, not just what questions is the person whose lab I found myself interested in or what opportunities are there, but what opportunities do I want to create for myself. And so in Steve's lab, I realized I wanted a really sort of much broader perspective on the immune system than what I had been doing, which was studying one subset of the immune system, and really was convinced that the entire immune system was unique and regulated in different ways and constrained by developmental parameters, and that it was foolish to try and understand why neonates were susceptible to infection by focusing on just one cell type. And so I became really interested in sort of how is the entire immune landscape different in the neonate. And to me, that meant studying hematopoietic stem cells. So I was in Steve's lab for all of my residency and most of my fellowship, which was 4 years instead of 3 because I had the benefit of that additional year. And, Steve was wonderful. And when I was like, I think I want to be a hematopoietic stem cell biologist, he was like, great, how can I help you? And so at the end of my fellowship,
Another great mentor.
yeah, at the end of my fellowship, I started in Emmanuelle's lab. And so, while there are ways in which, oh God, wouldn't it have been nice to have landed in the lab should have been in and had 4 years of sort of research under my belt, for funding and, for moving my own projects forward. Again, don't regret the meanderings that my journey took me on because, when I landed in Emmanuelle's lab, I really knew what I wanted, right? I wanted to study hematopoietic stem cells, semen progenitor cells, and I wanted to do it in the fetus and the neonate, and I wanted to do it rigorously. And that meant being trained as a hematopoietic stem cell biologist by one of the best and really doing a postdoctoral fellowship, right? And so I became an assistant professor at Columbia. So I stayed there. I was very lucky to be able to do that. Rich Poland, love that man, hired me because I said, I want to work with Emmanuelle Passegué. I want to sort of start over in her lab. Will you hire me anyway? And he was like, of course.
Nice.
And so I had just become an assistant professor 6 months after starting what I consider to be my like full postdoctoral, whatever these titles mean, training experience. And so for those 7 years, clinically, I was an attending physician, although fresh out of fellowship, right? But so I was an attending physician, an assistant professor in the clinical sphere, but I very much considered myself a postdoctoral fellow and a mentored researcher in my other sphere. So to get back to your question about funding, I applied for a KO8 and didn't get it the
I have a
first go
good if
around.
I could interrupt you again.
Yeah, please.
For all of our listeners, Amélie and I have had a couple of fun intersections during our careers, but I think one anecdote that we didn't tell was that she was a cross-covering fellow, I think, when I was a medical student sub-I in the NICU at Columbia.
I was trying to remember if I was a fellow or if I was a resident, because I don't know that our timelines are that far apart.
I think
But
you were a
yes,
fellow because I
maybe I was
remember
a first year.
I had a great group of residents that I was with,
Yeah,
and you were,
I was
um
not one of them.
you were yeah, and the on-service fellow was a different, also outstanding woman
Okay.
too,
Yeah,
but yeah, we
yeah,
did meet, and I also, wanted to, again, give another shout out to Dr. Poland, who I think, um, for a long time ran that NICU with, like, equal parts vision and care,
mhm.
is one way to say it. When I interviewed with him, he, he just wanted to support and encourage me, and so he gave me 2 of his books just so that I would have additional, resources, like, to increase my learning as I was, like, a medical student, quite excited about becoming a neonatologist in the future. But he looked at me and he said, "These are not a bribe."
Yeah,
That's great.
Which I thought was really funny, but the man was also a realist, so I just kinda wanted to interject with that, I don't know, that anecdote to I don't know, to tell another good story about leadership and about somebody who, when you went
yeah,
to him and said, "Hey, I wanna do this other thing, and I think it's gonna be great," he said, "I'll support you." That's really
yeah. That's
wonderful.
totally Rich, and he's one of a whole series of people I've been fortunate enough to have in my career, that have really valued me for what I wanted to do.
Yeah, it's really heartwarming to hear about, these good
Yeah,
leaders that,
yeah,
supported a superstar in the making. Thanks.
Can I ask you because you pivoted, right? For
yeah.
so when did you determine was the right time to pivot? And did you like drop a project? Did you complete it and then pivot? I mean, obviously the time in which you became a faculty member is an easy time to pivot, but maybe you could talk to our listeners about that.
Yeah, it I think the time to pivot w I don't know, I almost feel like you're asking me when's the right time to have a baby. There's never the right time. The time to pivot for me was when intellectually I knew that I needed to do something different. And so I did finish up the project that I was working on with Steve. I joined his lab. His lab had made a really fascinating observation about what at the time they thought was prenatal versus postnatal maturation of certain natural killer subsets in the mouse. And so I joined his lab in part because I was like, ooh, immunology, pre and postnatal, like that's a window into a developmental period that I'm really interested in. And so the goal was for me to work on that. And sort of as an aside, I was like, oh, but we should check to see if this is really what's happening in humans, right? So I ended up never touching a mouse in Steve's lab. And instead, my entire project was establishing and then generating a biobank, small biobank, for me, of human fetal samples that we used to ask this question of whether there was a similar pre versus postnatal maturation restriction point in humans. And the answer was there wasn't. You could see both of these subsets in the human prenatally. And it turns out that this was probably something that had more to do with tissue specificity of these natural killer cell subsets and kind of coincidentally in the mouse straddled birch. And so in Steve's lab, I was wrapping up this project of sort of describing what we had found in human fetal specimens. And, in some ways was very lucky to be able to come out of that experience with a publication to essentially describe that. This also coincided with when I had my daughter. And so there was a natural sort of pause in my scholarly activity while I was pregnant and had her and took the time off that I did. And so I uh, had, several conversations with Steve about sort of, okay, well, as we're wrapping up this project, submitting it for publication, and I'm looking to the future of now wanting to pivot intellectually and kind of understand what that meant. And as I mentioned earlier, to me, what that really meant was I need like an expert in the field to mentor me. I'm not going to just say that because I want to study hematopoietic stem cells, now I do. Like you need to
Yeah.
learn the
So
field,
it's a whole new field. Yeah.
whole new field. And so I had again this sort of forced blessing of time while I was sort of wrapping up one project, taking time off for my maternity leave, and then being fortunate to, Emmanuelle came to Columbia right when I was ready to make that transition. And so to reach out to her and say, I would love to learn to be a hematopoietic stem cell biologist from you, but I want to focus on a developmental window that you don't focus on. And so can I do that? And so it ended up being the best of both worlds because and she was like, "Yes, of course." And so I joined her lab 6 months before I finished fellowship. I did that knowing that I had a faculty position at Columbia, right? And so that made it, I don't think switching labs 6 months before you finish fellowship, if you're leaving that institution, is a good idea. But I knew that I was staying, and so I switched because I was, very much building this new sort of phase of my research training. So yeah, that's sort of when I pivoted. And it did mean that I felt like I was starting over again scientifically at the same time as I was starting as an attending, which is another, new beginning in our clinical training. Um, so, in terms of for young people out there who are looking to make a pivot, there's never a right time and there's probably never a wrong time either. I think these things take a little bit of guts and a lot of luck. Um, and you can't plan for luck. You can't
And
plan
a
for
lot of
like
hard
the right
work.
person showing
I
up.
was gonna say, yeah, it's a lot of hard work. You gotta put in,
Yeah.
but if it's what you're interested in, I think
Yeah.
then it doesn't feel like a lot of hard work.
Oh, it was so fun because I was basically being, the opportunity that I got in Emmanuelle's lab was to kind of build this program for myself that I got to take with me. So again, I'm very fortunate that I was able to do that. And both that she gave me the resources and the autonomy to do that. But also that because I was an attending physician, I had the financial luxury of being able to do that. I'm the breadwinner for my family, and these sort of factors make a difference, right? We had a young baby, but I was an attending, and so I had the ability to say, yes, you know what, I'm going to be a postdoc for another 7 years. Because that didn't have the sort of financial repercussions for my family that maybe it would have if I didn't have an MD and if I wasn't also being a neonatal attending physician on the side. Um, but fundamentally, I just feel like I got really fortunate to be able to build that for myself. And yeah, I worked hard. Of course, I worked hard. I worked really hard, but I love it. So most of the time, it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the delights with interviewing you is to talk to people who are earlier stage in their physician scientist journey. We've had some really, inspiring and, phenomenal giants in the field on this podcast, which has been an honor. But I think it's equally exciting to think about how you're building your program. And if I could think about the recipe that's produced this successful physician scientist that you are, it has been a combination of great mentoring, following your heart, really, like the science that gets you out of bed in the morning, that delights you, but also a ton of hard work because Amelie, your CV is phenomenal. And I just, want to give you credit for that, you did have luck and good mentors, but it also feels like you were willing to put in the long hours, put the manuscript to paper, and then get the feedback that you needed to get stuff across the finish line. And when people are looking at the scientists and physician scientists specifically to support, it's the ones who have a track record of documented productivity, which you clearly had. So I also think we should give some credit to you for that and highlight that, for physician scientists who are coming up, who might be listening to this, that it's really important to take every opportunity and get something to put on your CV from it, which is what you did.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's
Um,
true, you did have a lot of hard work. I mean, we were gonna talk a bit about your funding journey. Maybe you could share your insights on that and all your hard work along the way.
Sure. Um, yeah, I will say when I was a grad student in Dan's lab, all of the postdocs wrote for fellowships. Just that was the expectation, right? And so I just thought that that's what you did. And when I was with Steve, I was like, okay, I'm going to write all of these fellowships. And he was like, great, go for it. And I wrote all of these fellowships and I got none of them. And I was sort of really demoralized by it. But I also realized that not everyone else was doing that. And so I think that someone told me this statistic, which I don't know if I believe, which is that on average, you submit 6 grants before you get your first one. So I definitely got my failures in under my belt. Again, failures in air quotes. Um, and so then when I joined Emmanuelle's lab, what's that?
your reps, your
Yes,
training reps.
exactly.
We do lots of training reps in my lab, and no, and they build on one another, right? Like,
Yes.
typically,
Yeah.
your first application is not the one that hits, it's the one that's
Yes.
informed by the previous version. Even I submitted one today, this morning, and I thought, if I had one more day, I would have put a schema in this LOI." But, you know, it was already quite good, and I
Yeah.
didn't feel like I could make a schema that was as good as the writing, and so I turned it in with Amit. But the next time I put it in that LOI, my schema will be more of all.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think um, I have come to really enjoy writing grants. Like, I actually love it. I
Mhm.
think it's so much
Me
fun.
too.
I love it too.
It's so different from paper writing. When you're reporting on your data, yes, that's exciting and you're telling a narrative, but you also have to be very honest about what you did and very
Mhm.
factual. And there is editorializing. All of us do that, of course, in all of the sections, not just the discussion, but it's a very different kind of thinking and a different kind of writing. And writing a grant it's just like dreaming. So I ended up so when I joined Emmanuelle's lab, again, started writing lots of grants. wrote lots of things that didn't hit. And then I wrote a sort of small, quote unquote, internal grant at Columbia that many institutions do, and they're wonderful. They're such an important part of physician scientist training opportunities because they give you that practice ground to write a grant, and then they give you small pots of money that are not actually that small. And when you're in a mentored research position and you don't necessarily have unlimited resources, or at least independent resources, having that is pretty amazing. And so I was really lucky to get a sort of internal award at Columbia called the Gerstner Award. That was my first grant ever, so I'll always be very grateful to that organization. Um, and then I submitted the first round of my KO8 sort of career development award 2 or 2.5 years into my work with Emmanuelle. And I didn't get it. And that was still to this day the best experience that I've had as a researcher, because the summary statement and the feedback that I got was awesome. All of it was on point. All of it was critical. All of it was, I mean, what do I want as a scientist? At that time, then and now, I just want to be taken seriously, and I want smart people to listen to what I have to say and to help me make it better. And that's exactly how I felt with that summary statement. And the opportunity to rework the grant and respond to sort of, where people kind of pointed things out that I was like, well, actually, the reason that that's less relevant is because of this. I was like, oh, but I understand that I needed to say that in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And so still it was on me, not necessarily on the reviewer. And look, I am sure I will have plenty of reviewer 2 moments in my career. I hope I do, because I hope it's a long career. But that particular experience, and I think it helped that my K went to a dedicated K study section. So that was just like this formative experience of of grantsmanship, right? Essentially, and how how you think about writing about what you want to do, how you talk about that, how you convey it to people, what it means to show feasibility, what it means to kind of talk about impact. And so I rewrote the K and I, resubmitted it on March 12th, 2020, 4 days before the world shut down. And I got it on that go around. And so then I, was K funded, which was really exciting and gave me a little bit. I continued, I think I wrote a few more grants, sort of smaller things, again, internal or foundation opportunities after that. And didn't get any, but it also gave me sort of a little bit of breathing room, which is one of the points, I think, to really sort of dive into developing this research program that I was trying to develop. And so that was really powerful. And being K funded comes with all kinds of protections, right? In terms of your research time and sort of the recognition of the trajectory that you are trying to be on. And so that was really, really helpful. And as I was wrapping up my work in Emmanuelle's lab, and we had sort of submitted our paper for publication, and I was starting to think about next steps and, thinking about my independent laboratory and sort of what would that be built on. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to just submit an R01. And I submitted an R01. And part of the reason that I did it when I did is that it was like a special RFA specifically on like fetal immune ontogeny. I mean, the description just felt like it was like, "Dear Amélie, please apply for this grant. Thanks."
I remember that RFA, actually. It's a beautiful RFA for
Yeah, it just felt really aligned with what I wanted to do anyway. And so I felt like I didn't have to, force anything. Like I just got to write, and it was this opportunity to dream, right? And to just be like, well, what are the next steps? Like, what is the next question or one of the next questions, right? And so I did it to get my reps in, right? I did not, by any stretch of the imagination, think that it was, going to get funded. But I wanted to recreate that experience of getting a summary statement from 3 smart people who had read my ideas and given me the benefit of their sort of expertise to write back and be like, well, here's what we think. And so I submitted that in December, and it was the last call for the RFA, right? And so that's why I did it when I did. Like, because otherwise I would have found an excuse to like put it off for a cycle, right? And be like, well, with this preliminary data, it'll be stronger. But I couldn't do that, you know? And again, in retrospect, like, thank goodness. So I submitted it in December of 2023. And it was discussed, which I was really, really proud of. It got discussed and it got a good score, but it wasn't going to be funded. But again, it was the critiques were things that I thought were perfectly appropriate and on point. And importantly, things I could fix,
Nice.
right? It wasn't
That's
like this
great.
is a bad idea, or this isn't going to pan out, or this is not important, right? It was, this is a great idea and this is important, but we need a little bit more preliminary data to be convinced. And I was like, I know, I agree. You're totally right. I can do that. I've been doing that. And so that was, that was a fun experience. And then actually, literally the third day that I was at Cincinnati Children's in my new job, I was notified that this R01 was going to be rescued, essentially, with like end of the season budget things.
So
And
awesome.
so, yeah, it was kind of crazy, and I essentially had to resubmit the whole thing from Cincinnati Children's. But the folks here were like, "Oh, we'll help you do that, no problem," and they were amazing in terms of sort of putting all of the documents together that we needed to, and getting the approvals that we needed to. Um, so yeah, so I landed here, 3 days in with at my new position with an R01. So
Probably your lab wasn't even, like, ready to go, right? 3
no,
days in? Like, it's like, where's the you're like,
yeah.
"Where's my space again?"
Oh, I didn't have an IACUC protocol that was I had nothing. I had nothing, right? And so I did have to scramble to put a lot of those things together, and I'm grateful. I mean, I wrote that mouse protocol like nobody's business. That thing was in and approved. Like, I could not have done it any faster.
Oh, that's a
Um,
great way to just push through that administrative
It's a
challenge.
true a
Yeah.
oh,
transition.
oh yeah,
It's
you
Yeah.
so
have to
rough.
rip that Band-Aid off. But yeah, so it felt really good. And now I feel like, okay, well now I can submit my first real R1 sometime in the near future. But it felt really exciting to sort of be given this incredible opportunity, which is what I feel I've been given here at Cincinnati, to ask my own questions. And it felt like a bunch of other people were like, "Yeah, we want you to ask your own questions too." So it felt great. It was such a great way to start, what is otherwise a somewhat intimidating transition. But it felt pretty good to start it this way.
That is the strongest way to start it with a brand new R01. So
Yeah.
In your
congratulations.
hand, ready
That
to go.
killer move. That's like a superhero type of move. So you pulled it off.
And your recruiter, right? Like, your division chief is you're already making them look good, right? You're like,
Yeah.
"See,
Yeah.
I
I
was
got one right off
I
the
was
bat."
really happy to be able to send off that message being like, "Thanks so much, and by the way."
Well, and you're in a really fruitful environment there too. I don't know, do you wanna take a minute to talk about your, I don't know, your fabulous colleagues and as neonatal physician scientists there at Cincinnati?
Yeah, I mean, I came here for them, I came here because I wanted to be part of a group of, people who were doing science that mattered to babies. And what I love about the group here is that there's all different kinds of research. So there are a few basic scientists like myself. That was something that was really important to me, that there be other basic science neonatal physician scientists. Um, but then there are also lots of other folks that are doing amazing clinical research, clinical trials, sort of patient-based stuff, which is totally out of my wheelhouse. And so, the first month or two that I was here, I was like, huh, all of the stuff that I'm doing in mice be really cool to look in like humans. And there were like 3 colleagues who were like, oh, I can help you with that,
Nice.
which is great because I know my lane. My lane is mice, but I'm happy to like, travel with other people that can do other things. And so, um, yeah, I just felt really excited to come to an institution where there were lots of physician scientists, and not just in the division of neonatology. To be honest, one of the biggest draws for me coming here was the hematopoietic stem cell group, the experimental hematology group. And I'm also in the immunobiology division, which has some amazing researchers. And so for all of the spheres of sort of science or clinical medicine that I do, there was a group here that I just felt really privileged to be a part of. And for all three of those groups to be at the same place, just felt really, really lucky. And I remember, I lived in New York City for 23 years before I moved to Cincinnati. And I remember thinking at one point, man, Cincinnati Children's, that's like my dream job. Too bad it's in Cincinnati. And then being like, but wait, what is that self-imposed barrier? My husband's from Indiana. I went to high school and college in Chicago. Like, this is silly. I mean, we became New Yorkers, but I love what I do, and I was fortunate that my family was willing to come with me. And so, yeah, I was really intentional when I was thinking about sort of starting my own lab and transitioning to independence about where am I get most likely to succeed. Um, and this place was to me one of those one of on the very short list of places that I would have just been so excited to land at, and I did. So
Congratulations. That's such a great story. And like just hearing about your transition to a new place is really inspirational and sounds like you made the move really easy and your colleagues were super helpful, which is always really important.
well, I think it's hard, and to address for younger people who are thinking about it, physician scientist training is long, and unlike, I don't know, I'm going to make a false comparison maybe, but like in this day and age, and now we can talk about it, right? Like we have other obligations in life. We have spouses and we have children and we have networks of friends and we have families. And by the time that you're making this transition, most of us are like maybe a little bit further along in life and have ties and obligations that make it, not so straightforward to just pick up and leave. Um, my parents were academics. We traveled around a lot when I was younger because my dad was a professor, and I always assumed that I would need to travel to like move to where the best job was. And maybe that perspective kind of, I always assumed that I would need to move around. Um, so maybe that made it easier, but it is hard, with all of I, I do believe that there's a right place for people and that right place for one person is not the right place for another person, right? And also being in the right place at the right time is really important. And it's really hard, and opportunities are few and far between, right? Like it's a hard thing to get a position like this. And then if on top of that you're constrained because, and constrained is not the right word necessarily, maybe because you have the luxury or the privilege, I should say, of having a child who needs to be somewhere or a family network that is only in one part of the country. It's hard to sometimes be able to have the freedom to jump at an opportunity, like the opportunity that I got. And so I am lucky, again, that even though we had an incredible network of friends, and my husband is a musician, and so leaving New York City was not his first choice, he came with me, nevertheless. And so, yeah, I was lucky to be able to look around and say, well, where am I going to be most successful? And the advice I heard this piece of advice once, and never has it rung more true than when I was making this transition, which is basically try and find the place where there are as many people who are smarter than you as possible and go there. Um, so that was definitely a guiding principle for me.
That's awesome advice. And you've had a lot of success like since you've been there. You had a beautiful cell paper last year. Maybe you could talk about what your like recent studies and next steps or directions scientifically from spin off of that paper.
Sure, I would love to, and we have 7 more hours, right, for this part of the conversation? Um, so, yeah, the cell paper
To you for 7 more hours. Yeah.
My
Yes.
schedule will definitely allow that.
right, mine too. Yeah, again, the cell paper, I was really lucky to be able to have my work published in such a high impact, high profile, journal, because certainly that opens doors in terms of people kind of being aware of your work and sort of, reaching out or knowing who you are and wanting to collaborate when you reach out to them. But for me, it was really foundational because I was trying to establish sort of what the hematopoietic stem and progenitor hierarchy looks like in fetal and neonatal time points in the mouse using, as cutting edge and as sort of rigorous techniques and approaches and assays as the field uses. And in fact, one of the pieces of advice that Emmanuelle, my mentor, gave me, this was a very intentional choice on our part. She was like, "You want a big paper that really, you're trying to establish yourself. You're trying to establish a field of research. Don't sell your efforts short. Let's put something together that's really foundational." And again, with all of the pressures to be productive, right, which actually codes for publish as much as you can, there were times during the 7 years where I was like, "Oh god, is that really the right, sort of strategy to take?" But again, I was lucky. I was protected. I had a K award, which meant that I was protected. I had an attending physician position, which meant that I was protected. I had the luxury of being able to build that research program, and so that cell paper was really, looking at hematopoietic stem and progenitor cells in the fetus and neonate, defining them phenotypically and functionally, and then starting to ask the question, what about those cells contributes to neonatal susceptibility to infection? And one of the things that we ended up focusing on, and that is now sort of a major focus of my research, is sort of the myelopoietic process, right? So, how are myeloid cells generated? There's steady state myelopoiesis, which is the every single day the body needs to churn out a certain number of these very short-lived cells. And then there's what we call emergency myelopoiesis, which is at times, and those times are in response to inflammation, infection, sort of malignancy, certain stressful challenges when the body needs to produce more and more quickly. And that's a hallmark of infection and inflammation in the adults is the emergency myelopoiesis response, which really starts at the hematopoietic stem and progenitor cell level. And that's why I think that the hematopoietic stem cell is an integral part of the immune response, because from the myeloid cell perspective, it really is. It has to be actively engaged. Um, and what we found was that that does not seem to happen in the fetus. And that could have been because fetal hematopoietic stem cells intrinsically cannot engage in those emergency myelopoiesis pathways. And so it wouldn't matter sort of what you threw at them. They're just developmentally kind of immature, so to speak. What we found is that that doesn't seem to be the case. So there were plenty of ways in which we could elicit adult-like myeloid production out of fetal stem cells, but we had to play tricks to do that, right? So it had to be out of the fetal environment, sort of in a dish or in an adult recipient, because we do a lot of transplantations in hematology. And ultimately, what we realized and discovered is that fetal stem cells can engage in this pathway, but they don't do it in vivo. And the reason for that is extrinsic restriction. And we identified maternal IL-10 as one
That's
thing
so cool. That
that
is so
restricts it.
cool.
The thing is, it's kind of funny, again, talking about luck, like, there are lots of different, mechanisms that I thought could be playing a role in this extrinsic restriction, and to this day, I still think that there are other things that we could interfere with, and we would get the same effect, but I picked IL-10 for a variety of reasons, and so
Why? Tell us why.
because IL-10 has a really long history, in pregnancy, right? It is a crucial pregnancy cytokine. It's been shown to be so important in kind of setting the stage for the maternal decidual immune response, to pregnancy, and to really establishing that tolerogenic environment such that the pregnancy is successful. And so I wanted to mess with one of those mechanisms, initially, frankly, just because I wanted to kind of like break the barrier down. Well, what's interesting is that when you remove IL-10 from the mom, in some ways you break the barrier down, but we saw very little increase in inflammatory cytokines in the fetus, even in the mom that was an IL-10 knockout. And yet, we were now able to see partial restoration of emergency myelopoiesis in fetal stem and progenitor cells, both transcriptionally and functionally. And so that's actually one of the big next steps for the lab, is to figure out what the mechanism is and to really try and understand, how is the fetus sensing maternal inflammation? And what is the signal that is being transmitted? And I don't think it's IL-10. I don't think IL-10 is crossing the placenta. We see no increase in IL-10 levels in the fetus following maternal inflammation. And we've started to look at lots of other metabolites, and there's all kinds of differences, right? Like, the fetus is not ignorant of the stress that the mom is experiencing and of that maternal inflammation. But I think it's being transmitted to the fetus in through signals that are not what we immunologists typically think of when we think of inflammation. And so one of the big directions for the lab now is to try and figure out how that signal is transferred. So that's one of the things that we're interested in. One of the other big questions is, right, so for now, I've been really focused on, here are fetal stem cells and what they're capable of doing. Here are adult stem cells and what they're capable of doing. And let's compare and contrast and look at all of these differences. But what I'm really fascinated by is, well, how do you get from the fetal to the adult state, right? How does a stem cell grow up? What does that maturation process look like? When does it happen? What regulates it? What do we do in the NICU that messes it up? Because I'm sure the answer is lots of things, right? What are the consequences of that delay, potentially? And then ultimately, if we can understand the kinetics of hematopoietic maturation, can we boost it in situations where that might be beneficial? So that's another big question that the lab is trying to answer. And then the last question is, well, how do hematopoietic stem cells remember their experience in the perinatal window of life, right? I mean, there's plenty of examples of memory. And I use that word with a bit of trepidation, because immunologic memory means a certain thing to certain people. And I'm not talking about antigen-specific memory in this particular context, right? But we know that cells of all kinds in all different systems retain some form of memory of prior exposures, right? Whether that's borne out in the epigenome, or in sort of the differentiation to different subsets of daughter cells. Cells retain a memory of their experiences, and hematopoietic stem cells are no exception to that. And we know in adults that hematopoietic stem cells certainly are influenced by prior exposures, and we're only just now starting to figure out what the consequences of that are. And I'm really fascinated in sort of exploring how our neonatal, fetal, so maternal exposure, fetal and neonatal exposures, how does that sort of imprint itself on the hematopoietic system in a way that has implications for hematopoietic function throughout the lifespan? So hopefully that'll be the third sort of major area of the lab.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We're excited to see what you find out,
Well,
for
thank you.
definitely, for sure. In terms of our next discussion, we
Yeah,
always like to close with
sure.
something fun about our guest and their research team, whether it's like favorite music you like listening to while riding. We did have a pre-discussion about that you're a new driver and you don't listen to music while you're driving.
I
So
cannot. I
so
cannot.
that's okay. But anything that your team likes to do together, any cool traditions, excuse me.
I was thinking about this question, and I was like, I just don't know what the answer is. And we don't have any fun traditions yet.
Yeah,
Um,
you need some. You
I
definitely
need some.
need
I
some.
know. Well, when I was leaving the lab, my Emmanuelle was like, "What is the Collins Lab tradition going to be?" And I was like, "Oh my god, I don't know. That's so much pressure." Um, so it's like this. It sort of going back to this conversation we had about wanting to be intentional about things like lab culture. which I care very much about, right? I'm very sort of careful about who's in the lab and making sure that they understand what kind of science I like to do and how I like to do it, and that they're sort of like-minded. Um, and also, you can't like impose that from the outside. And so we don't have any traditions yet. Um, but I'm open to suggestions and already want to be very. There are certain things that I think all labs should do, right? Which is celebrate successes. And so that means celebrating submissions, not just awards.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Submissions of things.
Always celebrate the submissions. You have to. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to what we were saying earlier. I've told my folks, even at this point, I want everyone to submit grants. And getting it is really only one of the many reasons that I think it's important to submit them. And so the submission is what's really important. Is not, I mean, obviously I want them to get them too, but that's only one of the reasons to write a grant. And so, yeah, hopefully we'll develop Collins Lab traditions, and frankly, my answer to Emmanuelle was like, "Well, I don't know what the Collins Lab traditions are gonna be because I don't know who the Collins Lab is yet." So, I expect my people to contribute to that decision too, because it's their lab just as much as mine.
Well, then instead of that, maybe you could leave our listeners with a pearl of advice for early career investigators or something inspiring you'd like to share.
Pearl advice. I think ultimately you have to do this because you love it. And if you don't love it, then you should do something else, and figure out what that thing is that's worthwhile of your time and your blood and your sweat and your tears and your weekends and, your daughter's dance recital that you couldn't make. Um, because whether or not this is the right thing is a topic for another podcast, but this career demands a lot of us, personally as well as professionally. Um, and I think you have to know that and acknowledge it, and fight to make it better and more balanced and more fair for more different kinds of people to do this work. I still think we've got lots of road to go in terms of that. But the reality is that it's hard. You got to work really hard, and if you don't love it, there's just no way. So a lot of especially in training, where we're shown or we're told that, being a physician scientist is like this prestigious thing. Well, if you don't like it, don't do it. What's also really awesome and cool and important? Taking care of babies.
Yeah.
What's
Babies are the
also
best.
really cool and important to the world is just doing research. So do it because you love it. And that, doesn't make it easy, but it makes it easier for sure.
I've been so inspired by our conversation, and, you and I have known each other for a long time. So,
We have.
yeah, but thank you. I have so many hashtags that we're gonna, put out with this podcast, like immunology for philosophers. We do science to make people feel better. What's the why? Development and action. I mean, this podcast is incredible. So, with that, we will wrap up. Thank you so much, Dr. Collins, for spending time with us and for sharing your journey. We hope that you, the listeners, also enjoyed this. Feel free to, give us some comments back on the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.